welcome to everyone who came out on this bitter cold, first real winter night here. I'm Sara Flounders, and I'll be emceeing today's program. I'm the editor of this book that we're discussing today. It's an anthology, and so some of the folks who have written the chapters are also here, but Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. That's the theme of it, and that's what we are talking about, the destructive character of sanctions as a weapon. And I've been a part of the SanctionsKill Campaign from its founding, also part of the International Action Center and contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper, part of the UNAC, United National Anti-War Coalition. Now, really, the Sanctions book began because we were interested in providing tools for grassroots activists who are fighting and mobilizing for change. And the Sanctions book is not just an intense analysis of the economic impact that sanctions are having on one country after another, and it's different in different countries. But it also, we tried to provide petitions, a toolkit for teaching sanctions in a class, and all kinds of other material, lists of webinars that we've done, and ways that activists who are tuning into this for the first time think, how do I explain this? How do I get some basic facts? More than 40 countries. No one could believe it was that many. And no matter who we talked with, they couldn't believe this country or that was on, so we decided to put it right on the opening page, the number of countries that are sanctioned either by the US, the European Union, UK, UN sanctions, really the number of countries, one right after the other, that are sanctioned and therefore strangled. And what that strangulation means, because it's different in one country after another. So I want to say for myself personally, in opposing US wars, I was in one country after another that was sanctioned. And you could really see that the sanctions create a personal crisis in family after family. That suddenly, having no essential medicine for high blood pressure, small infections, for diabetes, it's suddenly a death sentence. And so is living in a 20-story apartment building that has no working elevator and no pumps for water to flush a toilet, to wash a dish. It really makes homes unlivable overnight. And it's consciously done to create crises. The same thing with restricting chlorine and any kind of water purification. It creates an immediate crisis, and that crisis means death of young children overnight. Not only no chlorine, no essential salts, no way of replacing lost body fluid. So these are the crises that are created. Where broken bones without an X-ray machine, also a death sentence. And as these facts became more and more real to us and unbelievable here, because no one really in the US, it's never grappled with in that way. There's only instead description of whatever leader in a country is being demonized. He is a monster, and it justifies everything that's happening. And never the civilian population, especially the poorest, youngest, oldest, those with chronic infections. Now, when the funds are seized from the National Treasury, it means that the country that's sanctioned suddenly has no ability to pay for teachers, no ability to pay for sanitation workers or medical staff or whole industries that shut down. This is a brutal form of war, and what it really is an anti-personnel bomb going off inside every home. It's meant to divide people in absolutely frantic ways and to create waves of migrants and refugees who are desperate to get out of the situation. It's siege warfare, and it's deliberately targeting civilians. Now, I saw this firsthand in Iraq under US and United Nations sanctions. 500,000 deaths of children in the first 4 years. And there was no counting of those who were sick or aged. I've seen the impact of sanctions in Lebanon, in Sudan. In Syria, 1/3 of the population is displaced refugees. In Venezuela, with oil resources, they had built the most fabulous free healthcare system. There were small health clinics on almost every street in the most intense urban areas and barrios, where they dispensed basic medicines and monitored blood pressure and diet. Suddenly, when the US sanctions hit, the shelves were bare. You couldn't get an aspirin or gauze pads. There was nothing. The clinics closed. Not that they didn't have medical staff, but because they had nothing that they could dispense. We know Cuba, who has done so much. There's more medical staff, Cuban medical staff, operating in Africa than the World Health Organization provides. Picture that. One country is able to provide more health care in Africa than the World Health Organization. Cuba developed their own COVID vaccine, and yet it took a world campaign to provide syringes for them to give it to their own population. So they had incredible resources in terms of medical science, and yet they were absolutely barred from dispensing it to their own population. And I think just about everybody in this room, I would bet, helped on that syringe campaign to Cuba. Now, all of these sanctions are imposed by declaring a country a national security threat. That means a country like Nicaragua, 6 million people, is suddenly declared a national security threat. I mean, be real, but a national security threat. And yet, Cuba or Nicaragua or any of these countries are, in one sense, a national security threat. Why? Because they're doing for their population what's not being done here. And that is deeply threatening. That's why they're targeted for destruction. If they can provide it, if they're offering free health care and free education, and the US seems unable to do that, that's threatening. Sanctions are racist. They overwhelmingly target people of color in the global south, and the sanctions come back and hit us here. There's funds for endless war. That's profitable, and yet there's no funds for what we need here. And we're going to have a report on that during this program too. What's barred in terms of what's needed? There's 800 military bases around the world. $60 billion that went through in less than 24 hours for Ukraine. And yet, for 2 years, there was, would have only cost $20 billion to cancel student loans. They couldn't get congressional agreement. But overnight, there's agreement for war. Every political decision in the capitalist US is driven by profit. Now, in closing, I want to say that really the ability of the US to enforce total domination, that's what's slipping. And that's what we're also dealing with in this book. That they seem all-powerful, but even their inability to impose the sanctions that they're now passing shows a lot. The US war machine couldn't succeed in Afghanistan a country rated as the poorest country in the world. So they switched gears, focused it all on Russia. Could they destabilize, break up Russia, a huge military operation in the Ukraine, demanded the whole world go along with the sanctions on Russia. Thousands were passed, thousands of pieces of legislation by the US, the European Union, Britain, and so on. And what happened was all the countries of the global south refused to go along with it. Now that was a shock and a rage. It's why there's aircraft carriers that are almost daily going through the Straits of Taiwan. The anger that China would continue trade, and the BRICS countries, not only China, but every one of, refused to go with the sanctions on Russia, continued the trade in oil and natural gas and fertilizer and grain. At that time, Biden was announcing this will lead to the complete collapse of the Russian economy. Regime change, that's what it was all about. It didn't happen. And that inability of US imperialism to impose its will is a big sign of what's happening with the empire now. They're extremely powerful. They can create great chaos, but they don't have their way. And that's more and more true, that there are whole new levels of cooperation. At the same time, we can see there's a new level of decay and the erosion of power right here. And the ability of many countries to find ways to connect with each other despite the power of the US dollar. It's a new period. The US sanctions have boomeranged. They've hit especially the European countries who've cut themselves off at the US demand from cheap gas with Russia. It's devastated the European economies, and it's also impacting the economy right here. In Britain, they say today working people have to choose between heating and eating. That's some choice. And we can look at the economy here, which really is on the verge of a total collapse. And we got to think about that and know it. It won't be exempt. The increasing sanctions on China have a very destructive impact on science, on technology, on a global scale. It is a globalized economy. And when you set out to break one part of the economy after another, one part of the exchange after another, as I say, more than 40 countries, a third of the world population, is today sanctioned. Every effort made to block every form of trade, seizure of their funds. And yet, there is a new levels of cooperation and trade agreements. The Belt and Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, shows a determination of countries to use cooperation and not endless war. The only thing the US really has to sell is weapons and war. And there's a need for a whole lot more. So countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America compare the US selling of weapons, and leaving them with huge debts. And they compare that to China's Belt and Road infrastructure plans for ports and railroads and bridges. There are now 149 countries that are part of the Belt and Road agreements. That is a real game changer. So is respect for sovereignty and independence. Now, where do we stand in this? And so many of the chapters here are about working people needing their own voice, that we can't rely on the complete lies of the media. We want to look at these new agreements in the most hopeful and helpful way. Last week, President Xi was in Saudi Arabia. Now that's a shock, you got to admit. But it wasn't just a meeting with Saudi Arabia. It was a meeting with all the Arab countries. And then there were trade deals with the Gulf, all the Gulf states. That is a new deal, which in the past were totally in the U.S. back pocket, really corrupt feudal monarchies, but now also trying to cut their losses and look in a new way at the future. So this is a corrupt and dying system. It's staggering around, threatening every country, looting the world, looting working people here. The only thing they're able to provide are cops and jails and the military machine. But now everyone knows that they are not all-powerful. They can create great pain in Syria, in Afghanistan. Look at Afghanistan, totally sanctioned. Well, after all those years of war, but they can't win. And that's what we're discussing, and that's the basis of the book, discussing and how to break this down in ways that people can understand it, use it, exchange material with each other. Thank you. So I'm next, our next speaker, who has such an interesting chapter in this book, is Erica Jung. She's our opening speaker. She organizes with NODUTDOL for Korean Community Development. She writes and speaks on the continuing U.S. threats on Korea and organizes solidarity with North Korea, the DPRK, and her chapter in the book is Surviving U.S. UN Sanctions and Military Threats. Erica.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and a big thank you to the SanctionsKill Campaign for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here among all of you to be talking about such an important issue. Now, earlier this month, the US, South Korea, and Japan imposed coordinated unilateral sanctions against North Korea, also known by its official name, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, after the US failed to levy new international sanctions through the UN Security Council. The US has also blacklisted 3 members of the Workers' Party of Korea for allegedly helping the DPRK's development of weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles. Shortly after, South Korea issued its own round of sanctions, targeting 8 individuals and 7 companies for supposedly contributing to the DPRK's weapons program. Japan also designated 3 entities and an individual for new sanctions. The US has imposed these sanctions in response to North Korea's missile launch this past year. North Korea is being cast as a pariah state. But in reality, the North Korean development of nuclear weapons is a strategy of deterrence against US imperial aggression. The US has occupied and demonized Korea ever since Korea achieved its independence from Imperial Japan. During the Korean War, US forces killed 3 to 5 million Koreans. This is a number that amounts to genocide. The US dropped more aerial bombs on North Korea than it did in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. And to this day, the Korean War is not over, thanks to US interest in keeping Korea divided. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not end the war. In fact, the US kept almost 1,000 nuclear missiles in South Korea pointed at the North for nearly 50 years. To this day, the US continues to occupy the South with almost 30,000 soldiers and over 70 military bases under the pretense of a North Korean threat and conducts joint military exercises with neighboring countries. Just this past year, in August, the US and South Korea began live military exercises against North Korea after a 4-year pause, dramatically escalating tensions on the peninsula. These exercises can involve up to 300,000 soldiers and often rehearse invasions of North Korea, including so-called decapitation exercises to assassinate North Korean leadership. US military exercises also expand beyond beyond Korea to all of Asia. In the same summer, the US gathered 25 countries for the RIMPAC military exercises in a clear show of force against China and North Korea. In the last few months alone, the US and South Korea launched the largest ever air drills through Operation Vigilant Storm, which involved over 240 aircraft and B-1B supersonic stealth bombers near the DMZ. Thus, calls for dialogue and diplomacy are ultimately empty and meaningless when the US ramps up its own military presence in a peninsula it has no business being in. Everything the US has done in Korea has been for its own geopolitical strategic interests, which rely on division, and thereby have a vested interest in preventing national liberation and reunification. And while sanctions are just one part of the imperialist playbook, their effects can be devastating. One of the most sanctioned countries in the world, North Korea can't trade with other countries, receive international loans, or import fuel or much of anything else. From agriculture to industry, sanctions impact all aspects of life in North Korea. Most things North Koreans need, they have to produce for themselves. There is no getting it from somewhere else. Sanctions impact water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare infrastructure. According to UNICEF, over 9.75 million people do not have access to safely managed drinking water. Crucially, one of the many types of items that is banned in North Korea, that is banned from being imported due to sanctions, is water sanitation equipment. Under sanctions, seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural equipment and other types of machinery are banned. And contrary to popular narratives that claim North Korea's government is intentionally withholding food from its population, food insecurity in the country is driven by a lack of access to modern agricultural equipment and techniques, and is further amplified by natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. In fact, North Korea has a public food distribution system, but it's unable to access the necessary agricultural imports from the world market. Sanctions also hugely impact the quality of healthcare available in North Korea. North Korea has a national public healthcare system that provides medical care to everyone free of charge. In general, its health indicators are much higher than in countries with comparably sized economies. However, because of sanctions, North Korea's healthcare system faces shortages of medicine and equipment that impact its ability to treat many preventable diseases. This is the reason why, for instance, up to 37% of deaths among children under 5 are caused by pneumonia and diarrhea. Under UN sanctions, all metal items are banned. Think about what that means. Metal is everywhere. Sterilizers, ambulances, medical appliances, x-ray machines, operating tables, hospital beds, water filters, metal tubes, pipes, pipe fittings. The list is endless. These kinds of items could be used to prevent and treat common health problems in North Korea. And if the basis of sanctions and US aggression against North Korea is really a concern for human rights, one might wonder why these sanctions seem to so obviously trample on North Koreans' right to live. While the UN makes exemptions on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian aid, applicants for these exemptions, mainly international and non-governmental organizations, face significant challenges, from long wait times for review and approval of exemption requests to unrealistic shipping requirements. These administrative barriers to humanitarian aid have had fatal consequences. In just 2018, delays and funding shortfalls resulted in an estimated 3,968 preventable deaths. The US condemns human rights in North Korea, yet in the same breath, it violates those very rights by imposing deadly sanctions. The US claims to want to end the Korean War, yet in the same breath, the US imposes greater sanctions as an act of warfare, knowing full well that North Korea sees lifting sanctions as a precondition to negotiations to ending the war. We must not be fooled by the rhetoric of the United States, but look instead at its actions. Despite these repressive US policies, however, North Korea has resisted sanctions and managed to hold its own and provide for its people. The North Korean people themselves continue to stay resilient and adapt to the many challenges they face through remarkable advancements in energy, agriculture, and textile and steel production. Now, as the Korean War continues, US sanctions against North Korea serve as a direct act of warfare. A direct act of warfare that is prolonging division and preventing reunification against the Korean people's wishes. Since the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the US has sanctioned the country's top export industries and any financial transactions involving the country. Collectively, both UN sanctions and unilateral US sanctions have resulted in an almost total ban on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. The international community must accept the sovereignty of North Korea and provide support rather than isolate, vilify, and strong-arm them. In order to move forward with reunification, we must promote peace and cooperation between the Koreas and reject US imperialism in all forms. As long as they exist, sanctions will continue to serve as a major barrier to renewing peace talks between the two Koreas. We must organize against sanctions in order to achieve peace, liberation, and reunification in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Next up, we're going to hear from about another country, resilient and determined, by Roger Wareham of the December 12th movement, who has organized solidarity with Zimbabwe under sanctions for decades. The largest number, actually, of sanctioned countries are African countries. It's a new colonialism. It's meant to divide and redivide. But particularly, the campaign around Zimbabwe, I think, stands out some of the strongest of the sanctions. So, Roger.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us to participate in this campaign, the campaign inviting us to participate in the campaign. Until recently, particularly in the left, the sanctions on Zimbabwe were not really well known. And as Sarah was pointing out, the US rationale for imposing sanctions is that the targeted country or the targeted people pose a national threat to US security or pose a threat to US national security. The only threat that Zimbabwe represented at the time the sanctions were imposed was that they really had the temerity and the audacity to just take their land back from the descendants of the settlers who stole it. That was it. Until that time, if you look back at Zimbabwe's independence struggle and when they achieved independence in 1980, it was a compromise that was reached. They were about to win on the battlefield, but the South Africans who supported the Rhodesians had basically was saying that if the armed struggle didn't stop in Zimbabwe, they were going to continue to bomb civilians in the countries that had supported that struggle, in Zambia, Tanzania. And so a compromise was reached at Lancaster House in Great Britain in 1980. And part of that compromise was that there would be one man, one vote, majority rule, but that for the first 10 years, the representatives of a white minority, and they were truly a minority in that country, would have a certain number of seats delegated in their legislature, in the parliament. In that same period of time, there would be an agreement of one seller, one buyer, that the whites who own the land would sell the land back to Zimbabweans, which is an interesting concept, that the thief would also be able to benefit from their thievery. That agreement was underwritten with the understanding that the money to pay the settlers would come from Great Britain and the United States for some reason. Who knows? I mean, how the United States got involved in that, that's the old kith and kin rap that they maintain to this day. So you rub my back, I'll rub your back. So it was underwritten by, I think it was Margaret Thatcher at the time, and I guess it was Reagan or Jimmy Carter. But that was the basis, because the Zimbabweans did not have, nor were they going to pay the people who stole their land for claiming their land back. When that period of time ended, and it was time to buy back the land, the United States and Great Britain reneged. They said, oh, well, that was done under a previous prime minister, that was done under a previous president. So otherwise, there was no country involved in it. This was like a personal agreement between people, and we all know that that's just not how that works. So what happened was the people of Zimbabwe, who had fought not to have a parliament, they had fought for their land, began to take the land back. Just, the soldiers from the veterans from the war began to take the land back. And the party that had led that struggle, ZANU-PF, said, we're going to do this. They supported it, but said, we're going to do this in an organized way. And so they set out a plan to reclaim the land. And part of it did involve paying people back for the fair value of the land, but that many of the whites owned, 2 or 3, 4 pieces of land. Ian Smith, who was the leader of the minority government, who said that they were going to rule for 1,000 years, very reminiscent of George Wallace, had property. He had one farm that was as large as Central Park. And so at that point in time, President Robert Mugabe, who had been portrayed in the Western press as the George Washington of his country, he was a consummate Democrat. He was the model that African leaders should model themselves after, according to the West. At the point in time when Zimbabwe said, no, we're taking our land back, then he morphed from George Washington to Adolf Hitler. I mean, they began to portray him as the Black Hitler, and they imposed the sanctions. And very interestingly, one of the sponsors of the resolution of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001 was Hillary Clinton, along with who was the senator in North Carolina? Who was the
Thurman. Thurman?
No, it wasn't Thurman. Thurman was South Carolina. Who was the North Carolina?
That's the Helm?
Helm. Was it Helm? Yeah. Yeah. Those were the co-sponsors of that resolution. And so at that point in time, this targeted sanction was only going to affect the leaders. The idea of the sanctions, the concept behind the sanctions was, as all of them were, to make the economy scream, to bring about regime change, to be able to put into Zimbabwe a party who was in their interest, in the interest of the West. And so they formed a party. The former farm owners formed a party called the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC. And they got a black trade union leader to be the head of it, but they were the force behind that party. And so at the same time that sanctions were being imposed to cripple the economy, because for the first 10 to 20 years of Zimbabwe's existence, they had, and you may have found this, that the extraordinary number of Zimbabwe medical people and doctors, they took their literacy rate in that first 10 to 20 years from about 10% to almost 100%, because they were very committed to raising the level, the quality of life of their population, and they understood that education was very important. So then the IMF and the World Bank intervened and said, well, no, you cannot devote this much of your economy to education. You have to devote it to repaying back the loans that we imposed on you. So that was the scenario in the early 2000s in terms of what Zimbabwe was looking at. It was to cripple the economy, and it was to impose regime change. When I was there in 2008, which was at the height in terms of just the devastating effect that the sanctions had on the economy, the inflation level was just through the roof. I think $100 US would make you an instant millionaire in terms of ZIMs. People were taking money, paper money, in wheelbarrows because the inflation was so great that their own currency had no real value. Despite that, and the Zimbabwe, the ZANU-PF, and the Zimbabwe people maintained their sanity, and they maintained, even with the difficulty, to maintain their ability to live and to feed themselves. Although you'd go into a supermarket and the shelves were empty, there just were not things there. So it was a very difficult time. How Zimbabwe has survived to this point in 2022 has been that they began a policy to look east, that they said that the United States and the West is not the only economy in the world. And they developed relationships with China and with India and with Russia in terms of being able to get the things they needed to survive. They could be in a much better place if the sanctions were not in place, but even with the sanctions, they've been able to overcome the most deleterious effects of the sanctions. The economy over the past 5, 6, 7 years has begun to open up and to thrive, so much so that President Mnangagwa spoke at the party Congress that we had representatives at to talk about their ability, that they had enough food supplies to survive for over a year if everything was cut off. The West, particularly the United States, because as I said, the United States had no nickel in this dime in terms of, they didn't colonize Zimbabwe, they didn't benefit from the colonization of Zimbabwe, but their kith and kin did. But even as the British started to waver around sanctions, the United States has remained steadfast. What's become apparent is that over the past few years, Zimbabwe has a number, and Southern Africa has a number of precious minerals and metals that the West wants: gold, silver, lithium. And so there's now a renewed interest, because as Sara said, all of this, the sanctions, all of this is driven by profit. All of this is the logic of capitalism, which is, in this point in time of its development, is that you have maximum profit drives whatever your decisions are. And that maximum profit is to squeeze every single penny out of whatever you're trying to exploit. So that's what's driving the question now of the continuation of the sanctions. They're very concerned about the role of China. I mean, the U.S. is very concerned around the role of China, because China does not impose quid pro quos on the aid they provide, their business arrangements. The United States is starting to moonwalk a little bit on it. This current meeting that President Biden's having with African heads of state, they had invited Zimbabwe to. The president said, you have me under sanctions, I can't come, I'm not going. But their foreign minister is there, because the U.S. is belatedly realizing that they've cut off their foot by maintaining these sanctions, particularly because Zimbabwe is a key member of the Southern African Development Community, SADC. And SADC, and what affects the Zimbabwe economy negatively affects SADC as well. So much so that for the past 2 years, SADC has called October 25th, has declared October 25th as the International Day in support for removal of the sanctions on Zimbabwe. So there have been demonstrations around the world for that. So that's the context now in which we're looking at it. Our position is the U.S. hands have to be off Zimbabwe, the sanctions have to end, but that Zimbabwe is moving forward regardless. They could move much better were those sanctions not in place. But our position is, and their position is, U.S. hands off Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. We've had several in-person events this week, and tomorrow Siu Hin and others will be in Buffalo at a program at the Burning Books in Buffalo, and on Thursday at the East Bay Media Center in Oakland. We were in Philadelphia. We were in the South Bronx last week. There was an incredible webinar on Saturday with more than 1,000 people who registered for that webinar. And so each of these events are a different kind of event. We're going to share and send out widely the link of the Saturday webinar with different speakers who have chapters in this book. I think Saturday's event, there are a number of international guests who have chapters. I will say, in terms of Roger, that the December 12th movement has 2 of the chapters here. So each of the Erica has the chapter from NODUTDOL. We're going to hear in just a few minutes from Siu Hin, who is also here with a video that he has been showing in China, which is going to be entered into a couple of film festivals. That's sort of exciting. So tonight's event is part of a whole series of events. I'm going to ask Rich Merino next if Rich would describe an event that we held in the South Bronx last week, because it's how we think creatively in producing each of these events, both meetings such as we're having tonight or in bookstores, but also in schools, in community centers, and so on. How do we make this question that's very abstract, intentionally so, make it real? So Rich Merino is a teacher in the South Bronx, also helps to coordinate the Bronx Antiwar Coalition, and an activist.
Thank you, Sarah. So when I was hearing folks up here talk about sanctions and how they're racist and how they affect primarily poor and working class people in these countries that are being targeted, I couldn't help but think about how there are many parallels to the people of the South Bronx. I feel like the people of the South Bronx are sanctioned by the US government too. And the reason that I feel that way is because when we think about sanctions and the outcome of sanctions and the purpose of sanctions, we're thinking about oppression. We're thinking about choking these people and depriving them of vital resources that they need to survive, right? We heard about sanctions preventing folks in the DPRK from getting clean water, right? And, you know, having materials that they need to build homes. And when I think about the South Bronx, I'm thinking about, hey, the people of the South Bronx are under sanctions too. Why? Because the people of the South Bronx are being deprived of vital resources that they need to live and survive and thrive. And when we're talking about lack of clean water, people in the South Bronx are really lacking clean water. We're lacking the resources needed to fix our aging and crumbling infrastructure. The South Bronx has the biggest concentration of NYCHA, public housing. And these buildings are dilapidated, they're falling apart, and the US government and the New York City government is making a very conscious decision to strangle these people. They don't want these people to survive and thrive, and that is what I think about when I think about sanctions. So I wanted to talk about an event that we had last week at CUNY Hostos. Hostos Community College, for folks that don't know it, it's part of the CUNY system. And I was looking up the statistics today because I wanted to just give you a sense of the student population there. So these stats are from 2019. So 52% of the students at Hostos are food insecure. 52%. That means that when they answered a survey and the question asked, did you have difficulty finding a meal over the past 30 days? 52% of people said that they did have difficulty. 63% are housing insecure, meaning that they don't have a permanent home while they're attending classes. And also 62% of students are living in a household earning less than $20,000. $20,000 living in New York City. Who can survive off of that? And these stats are from 2019. So I couldn't find stats for 2020 or 2021 or 2022, and I wonder why CUNY is withholding that information from us. But I wanted to share that so we have a sense of the student population that we're talking to. So when we had this conversation about sanctions on campus, we were finding creative ways to make this resonate with people there, right? Because I think that that's really our jobs, to find ways to make, people in the United States really understand what sanctions are. And when we learned about a struggle that students are waging right now at Hosto. So for the past 2 years, Hostos has had their cafeteria closed. Right now, students are not able to get a meal while they're on campus. And the reason, that we heard from the students, because they told us about a recent protest that they organized to demand a cafeteria at their campus. They told us that the cafeteria closed because it was not profitable for the vendors to serve food there. So that really makes us, that reminds us that, under capitalism, if it's not profitable, it's not going to be, we're not going to receive that service. So we talked about how food insecurity is a major problem for the people that are suffering under U.S. sanctions, right? We talked about Afghanistan as a country that is suffering under sanctions right now, and the difficulty that they're having in, feeding themselves as a result of these sanctions. And when we talked about that, when we use that angle to really help students understand, they're like, oh, we get it, because we also are food insecure right now. We are deprived of the right to buy food on campus that is affordable and that is healthy. So, believe it or not, we had about 12 or 13 individuals that signed up to stay in touch and continue the conversations. And they shared their thoughts on what they learned from that session. And a lot of the people that responded to our survey said, we're kind of under sanctions too, because we're finding it hard to find food also. So that's really how this thought came into my mind. I'm like, wow, I'm seeing that these students in the South Bronx are also sanctioned by the United States government. So as a teacher, I really hope that we can utilize this book to have these conversations with people in our communities and our networks, right? And what I really love about the book is that you don't have to read it in order. Since it's a series of writings, you can look at the table of contents and pick out something that stands out to you. Or maybe you can pick out an article that would stand out to somebody that you're talking to. So I highly recommend that we utilize this book to have these conversations and to really grow this movement, and to really help people understand that US imperialism and sanctions are a reflection of what's happening inside the United States as well. Because we all know that there are parallels to how oppression works domestically and how oppression works internationally. The end result is the same. And I think that if we find creative ways to draw those connections, then I think that we can really grow this movement and really do away with these sanctions. Because the one last thing I want to say is the DPRK and Venezuela are not talked about on the US left. We need to talk about these countries more. Because when you look into what these governments are doing for their people, it makes my jaw drop. So I follow a YouTube channel that takes news in the DPRK and adds English subtitles to it. And there was a recent report about a natural disaster that happened in the DPRK. And the government response was literally to build new homes for the people and give it to them for free because they lost their homes in this natural disaster. And Venezuela just finished building their 4 millionth home that they're giving away to individuals as well. So this is why these countries are sanctioned, and we need to stand up and defend these countries and really break through these narratives that the United States pushes to get people to not support these nations. And as Sara said, they're threatened because of the fact that they're able to accomplish so much, even despite these sanctions. They're still able to build homes for people and house their people. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richie. And let me say, for any one here who's teaching, or for a group wanting to make a presentation, really the books are half price. And we can also provide an EPUB format for it, and videos for it. We're really about providing resources, much more than selling books. So even if we're selling the book at less than it costs us to print it, it's well worth it, because it opens a conversation. When we did this in the Bronx, they gave out 20 books. Really, each of the students wrote in the hostos what the book meant to them in a line or two, what it had opened, what it had explained. And that made it a really creative kind of exchange. So speak to us if you think it would be helpful in any class that you're doing. Next up, I'm going to ask Karina Mullen, who is an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial academic and an organizer in New York, to come up. She's a professor of global politics and political economy at CUNY. And she's on the steering committee of the People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Economic Coercive Measures. And they're holding an event here at the People's Forum, I think in a month, and we wanted to really highlight that because it will draw together what we've been trying to do also. And as the Sanctions Kill Campaign, we're very much supporting that. So let me hand over this mic to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sara, for the introduction, and thank you to comrades on the panel. Really, I learned so much from your presentations, and I can't wait to buy the book and share with my students too. So just quickly, I just wanted to say a few words about the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Economic Coercive Measures. So like the work that you all are doing, we're trying to build firstly, not just political education, but also a movement, contribute to this movement of resisting U.S. imperialist sanctions. We know, as all the speakers here have spoken about, how violent sanctions are and how sanctions kill just as much as other forms of warfare. They also, our tribunal also thinks about sanctions as a tool of capitalist, neo-colonial capitalist accumulation as they facilitate, of course, the transfer of surplus value from the global south to the global north. They maintain racialized hierarchy in the international system, income deflation, underdevelopment, and of course prop up Western monopoly capital. So we also know that they're a means of disciplining and controlling global South sovereignty and blocking the emergence of a multipolar world order. So just quickly, our tribunal is going to last for about 6 months. And as Sara mentioned, we are going to have our launch event here on January 28th, and I hope you all can attend. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and organizations co-sponsoring and co-organizing with us, including Sanctions Kill, which we're, and NODUTDOL as well, which we're really excited about. Essentially, we will conclude, so it will be 6 months. The tribunal will conclude with a closing event hosted by the Simón Bolívar Institute in Caracas, Venezuela in July. The objectives of the tribunal are: 1, to build international consensus against the illegality of sanctions and against U.S. imperialism; 2, to distinguish sanctions against apartheid Israel and South Africa, so from below, as opposed to sanctions as a tool of imperialism, targeting countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Sudan, either on North Korea and Palestine and elsewhere. Essentially, we hope that you'll be able to join us on the 18th. Please check out our website, SanctionsTribunal.org. There's also a GoFundMe page there. We hope, we're all trying to raise money as well. It's a global, really, initiative, so it does require some resources. But mostly, we just hope you'll be there, support us, try and find ways to get involved with the tribunal, and feel free to contact me. Hopefully we can share my email. My email is karina.mullen@googlemail.com. I'm on the steering committee of the Sanctions Tribunal, but also check out our website. Come also this Sunday at 12 p.m. we will be having an event to announce the tribunal, not the launch event, but a sort of announcement webinar with some great speakers, including a comrade from NODUTDOL, and SanctionsKill, as well as Bikram Gill, who's an amazing scholar at Virginia Tech University. So thanks again. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Karina. And we will be sending out more information on that from SanctionsKill, and I'm sure the International Tribunal also will. But these efforts are really, how do we rally and educate people to explain a pretty insidious weapon? Now, I think we're at our keynote speaker, and then we're going to open the floor for a few minutes and take some questions. But Siu Hin, who has also come with a short video, it's just 8 minutes long, but it's a little piece of something that they're showing in China. But Siu Hin is a Chinese immigrant activist who coordinates a national immigrant solidarity network. He's worked in Southern California organizing Asian sweatshop workers and opposing anti-Asian violence. He regularly visits China, and he arrived last week from China and coordinates a China-U.S. solidarity network. He's a co-editor of this book, Capitalism on a Ventilator. We worked on this together, Siu Hin and I, last year, and he has a chapter in Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy that really deals with the CHIPS Act, which is, it's the CHIPS Act, U.S. sanctions will make China stronger. And that is the impact. As countries resist with great determination, they find workarounds. You either concede and surrender, and there's a determination not to do that, or find ways of fighting back. So the video that Siu Hin has produced is called Vaccines and Sanctions, and it's a joint China-U.S. activist production. I'm going to hand it over to him to describe some of what the film is doing and what he is doing in China and here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Siu Hin Li Xiaoquan. 大家晚上好. Good evening, everyone. And I'm very thankful for Sara Flounders to invite me to coming to this event. The documentary is a longer version for the total 34 minutes. It was a production between Chinese and American activists, and there was within 2 weeks productions. I proposed that before coming back to U.S. on mid-November, just a few weeks ago, and I need to bring some gifts to the American activists, and then I proposed to my network of friends and volunteers. One of the production studio is very professional. They pick up and said, why don't we make a documentary? And then so the production was really start on November 25th and then finish on December 1st. And so its quality is very high. If you saw on the video, you thought that maybe a multi-million dollars, but there's a zero budget. Completely zero budget productions. I don't even have a damn cameras. I'm using this pad to film that. And this is also, I'm going to talk about, this is a sanction because I am violating freaking dozen sanctions in US because this is not an iPad. People keep asking me, is this an iPad? It's not. This is a Huawei pad made in China. I cannot buy in US. I brought it back, and then this is very durable. I've been using this for 3-4 years. And so also a trouble between China and US for activism work. Many people have been supporting our work and want to have a voice in US, but also they fear to tell us about their name. They don't want me to mention their name in the US because they do not want to get sanctions. Because I do know people who get sanctioned in China cannot come to US, and then also they don't want me to get trouble. That's all the reasons. That's the reason when you say sanction, it's not just only talking about the sanction against a country, but against an individual. That is a racism. And also not just in China, but also in this country. Because don't forget, last 3 years in this country, there's a such thing so bogus, so racist, so crazy, the so-called Wuhan virus hoax. That created such a huge anti-Asian immigrant violence and hysteria that's, according to Stop AAPI Hate, over 10,000 people cases of the anti-Asian hate with hundreds of violence attacks and resulting in minimum dozens heavy injury or even murder. So that is not a joke. That is not a simple thinking about some kind of, when it's a sanction, it seems like a far away, but it's also affecting to our home in here, to our neighbor, to me, to you, to everyone. So this is a systematic, because in order to, just like I've been Pacifica Radio since 90s, done many war correspondent works, to went to Iraq, to went to former Yugoslavia, to former Soviet Union, to Africa. When you Western countries start the war, first you need to dehumanize themselves. To make it sound like they are evils. So same thing. When you start a sanction, you dehumanize these people from different countries. But I want to make sure, because I want to show the movie. But very simply speaking, when there's a CHIPS Act, because Dell wrote on this book, CHIPS Act, the first time I heard the CHIPS Act by Biden was thinking about was, I thought there was a TV show back 1970s, CHIPS. But that's what exactly is. When you're thinking about want to hurt something, do something against other country, they always they can find something very creative way that you cannot imagine. Like today, Plan A doesn't work, Plan B, Plan C, Plan D. They keep thinking about something that you very creative and that you don't even realize that you suck into it. CHIPS Act is an idea that's supposed to be that's saying that in theory is a very racist, that China stole US technology. It's not talking today, since 1980s, 90s, that have been US have been accusing China stealing the US high-tech technology from the 1990s. So there's a notion always in US saying that we need to prevent the Chinese high-tech spy. That's a very racist and stereotyping community. And then that's the reason there's a different type of high-tech sanctions since then, and then a target against Huawei. And now there's a chips, because they want not just only they're saying accusing China stealing the chip technology from US, but also want to, they're saying that like China is stealing all the production, chip production into China. That's a whole idea. So that's the reason that Biden spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in reality to want to create a chip act when they don't even have money to give a proper education to the poor immigrant community of South Bronx to any other places. They're spending this money, and then just a major giveaway, nothing to do with CHIPS Act. It's just another name to just give a big corporation big paydays. And when Pelosi went to Taiwan to provoke China, that became a huge crisis on August. There has been many multi-reports on China and other countries, not in US, almost no one reported. Her son, Pelosi Jr. was on the trip, accompanied her. And then she was not part of the official delegations. just only helping her mom to do some kickback business. They have been widely reported. That's not a street rumors. If you go even you can just Google, find multiple report about that. And then what have many speculators, many political analysts that time, they pointed out it's something to do with CHIPS Act because almost the same day. And then after Pelosi went back to the U.S. and then during the trips, and then they have all this secret to help her son, Pelosi Jr., to get arranged. And then the Taiwan, the biggest, one of the world's biggest semiconductor company, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, manufacturing company, TSMC, now they announced they will move the entire production to Arizona. Yeah. Last couple of days, they have a big announcement that they're going to be doing this. That is part of the CHIPS Act, part of the, it's an indirect sanction because what the U.S. want to do is want to bring all this back to U.S. and don't give anything to China. That's the whole idea behind. But one other thing, I don't want to hold you up too long, but when Pelosi, she has been known for such a racist, hysterical, anti-China politician since 1990s, and then with multiple sanctions. But probably, I think most of the people didn't know, her husband, Mr. Pelosi, and her son, Pelosi Jr., has a big-ass business in China. They have a multi-billion-dollar investment fund in China, making money for the last 20 years. And her husband, while she's attacking China, her husband, her son, had frequently traveled to China, stay in China, doing business. One point, even he had a Chinese girlfriend. And so that was, no one talked about it. So when the Pelosi says she is anti-China, I'm sorry to say that is a bullshit. Yes. That is another way to make money. And then they didn't tell you about that. That is when you say sanction, it's not just hurting other countries, but it's also helping the U.S. oligarchs, capitalists, to steal money, using another way to steal money for their own political and social and class interests. Thank you. And so the documentary is still almost complete. At this end of this week, we'll start going to push to the some film festival in China, and we're going to have a complete version on the online, and you can download, and or maybe if you arrange a showing, we're happy to help. Thank you.
Crazy. The COVID pandemic has exposed the failures of the United States domestically, with our inability to make sure that all people be protected and get the health care they need. It has also exposed the destructive role of the United States in the world, its failure to cooperate with other countries, and its protection of the profits of transnational corporations over the health of the people. But there is a more vicious role played by the United States in particular and the Western countries in general. They have been using sanctions as weapons against the world.
We can also see that sanctions was used where the vaccines were weaponized. What countries could receive the small supply of vaccines that were being distributed was based totally on who was complicit with the United States. Countries that were sanctioned in every way were prevented from receiving vaccines or the basic essential supplies. So Cuba could develop a vaccine, but the syringes, in order to deliver it to their own population, were in limited supply, and it was very difficult to get access.
The United States was playing a destructive role during that time when the Secretary General of the United Nations was calling for an end to the U.S.'s illegal sanctions. The U.S. escalated those sanctions, continued to put new sanctions on countries. And so as a result of that, countries really struggled to be able to get the items that they needed in order to take care of their population.
伊朗、古巴、委内瑞拉和阿富汗等国，美国对他们实施严厉的制裁，他们都没有收到任何美国的疫苗。美国甚至冻结他们去购买急需要治疗新冠的药物的外汇。
In the days since the pandemic has ebbed back in national attention, we have very consciously moved forward with a campaign against U.S. use of sanctions. But even this has now changed globally. The war in the Ukraine, the brutal NATO expansion into the Ukraine, the arming and weaponizing of the people in Ukraine, the firing on the Russian population in Ukraine, all of this created a crisis that could not be avoided.
According to SanctionKills, an international campaign organized by many peace and justice organizations and activists, including Sara Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and Siu Hin, to criticize Western countries using sanctions as weapons against the world. Sanctions are essentially the imposition of arbitrary measures creating inhumane economic hardship on a targeted country. Sanctions from the United States affected a third of the world's population, imposing more than 8,000 measures on more than 40 countries. Economic sanctions are also known as embargoes.
The U.S. effort to impose and to get all of the European Union and Britain to go along with the sanctions was to cut the trade relations with Russia. A very different thing happened though, and that is the rest of the world refused to go along with U.S. sanctions because they were still able to trade with China and have economic relations and exchange. And so sanctions on Russia, and now new, even extensive sanctions on China, are not succeeding. The people of the world increasingly are deciding to do what is in their own interests. They have a population to feed, and they need food, fertilizer, technology, and they can't get that from the West except by onerous conditions that are an assault on their sovereignty. So we have produced a new book, which is an anthology looking at the both difference that exists now and also looking at sanctions as a weapon that is used again and again against. There's a whole study of the impact of US and UN sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, on Iran, on still today the continuing sanctions on Syria, and so on. But the more than 40 countries is a real theme that we take. The number of countries that are impacted affects a whole economy regionally. So we're trying to explain this to working people here, that these sanctions come back, they boomerang onto the economy here with increasing inflation, recession that really people are coping with in the layoffs and in an intensely fragile economy.
Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy, is a book with several dozen writers, including Sara Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and me, comprehensive analysis against Western sanctions against other countries. The impact of sanctions on more than 40 developing and formerly colonized countries, countries 1/3 of the world population, was barely discussed in mainstream media for decades.
I think a necessity for the workers' movement in the US to explain to working people that racism, that bigotry, that attacks on another country are not in their own interests. And this really helps to combat also the anti-China sentiment that is being consciously whipped up every single day by the media. It's used to justify the new rounds of sanctions on China, whether it's in chips or whether it is in cotton from Xinjiang. Every form of US policy is to intensify and to justify sanctions. And we feel that this has to be combated within the United States. This has to be explained again and again. The books are one way, the webinars are another, the demonstrations and rallies are still another. But it's important for working people to have their own voice in this, and not only the voice of corporate power.
Now, globally, the United States is trying desperately to hold on to its domination of the world, and it's failing. It's not going to succeed because the world has seen and knows that the United States is not a reliable partner, is not an honest partner, will always put the profits of the corporations over the lives of its own people and people anywhere in the world. And the United States is harming itself by not cooperating with China and learning from the actions that China has taken over the past 70 years. The United States needs to let go of this hubris, of this American exceptionalism, and recognize that we have a lot to learn from people all around the world, and that it's necessary for our future that we become a nation of cooperation, of solidarity, of one that values human life and protection of the planet. The United States' future depends upon this change.
In contrast to the sanctions and vaccine imperialism of the United States against the world, China has launched successful vaccine diplomacy to support the world. Also, China supports global economic developments by encouraging more international economic cooperation. Last November, China organized the 5th China International Import Expo to encourage more global imports, especially imports from the Global South.
在进博会，中国非常慷慨，开他们的大门，邀请全世界，甚至包括许多目前对中国实施无数制裁的国家的公司，也被容许来销售他们的产品。Let me read a chapter I wrote from the Capitalism on a Ventilator. It's no secret that domestically, police brutality and the war on terror is in fact just more oppression for black and immigrant communities. There won't be help justice in the US unless there's a people's revolution for fundamental social change that demand the moving of money and wealth from the richest 1% and the war back to the working class, people of color, immigrants and indigenous people.
So I think that's a wrap. Thank you. And we can pass this mic around if there are any comments folks want to make. But Siu Hin wanted to do something else, and that is he wanted to get a few images of people with a chant, with a demand. You see how it was already sort of sliced into this film, and they keep slicing in other pieces. So if you can do that, or if you want to be in this book, we're going to a second printing next week. That's literally true. But the first 2 pages we wanted to have be quotes from people about what they got from the book. So if you can give us a sentence or 2, a couple of people here tonight have already done this, and that's really appreciated. If you can give us a sentence or 2, it would really, really be appreciated, and we'll include it in the book. So you just send it to info@sanctionskill.org, info@sanctionskill.org, and that will, we'll utilize it if we get it in the next week. So should I pass this around? Any folks want to comment? We need to exit out of here by 9 o'clock, so we have a little bit of time. Okay, Milos.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. I think we more or less here know what is the state of opposition to the international sanctions in the US. That is, it's not a wide movement yet, because probably the South Bronx and everybody else is under their own sanctions, and people just are not conscious about what's happening beyond this country. Recently I just saw on the news that there is still shortage of baby formulas here, so babies are under sanctions in a way, right here. So I'm interested more in who is actually fighting fiercely the sanctions in the world. And now we have a very new situation in the world that basically European sanctions on Russia are actually hurting badly working class and all Europeans. And I'm not getting in the news exactly what is opposition to the European sanctions on Russian gas and all of that, but maybe somebody could tell me a little bit, from the panelists or from the public, who knows, what are the movements in Germany or in England or in France, where people have to choose between the heating and the food, as you said tonight, So that's something that is very kind of like a direct connection that people can see easily, and I'm just wondering, here and there some politician says something in Germany or here and there, but what is the state of the kind of like a wider movement to stop the sanctions, not only on Russia, but in general?
I'll just say, because there's very little coverage here of these demonstrations that have been in the many, many thousands in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Britain now, and throughout Europe, because it has hit hard. It really has hit hard. They went along. Now the leadership in these countries are looters themselves. And if they thought the sanctions would bring down and dismember Russia, they were all in. They were all in for it. When that didn't happen, and instead it hit them, then they have to deal with their own population. And so, I mean, you have a leadership who are pirates. They're colonial powers. They're imperialists in every sense. So they were for going along with this, but it has been disastrous. And it is, you've seen one government after another has fallen, and in comes a new group doing the same thing. They have no independence because they are chained to the NATO military machine. That is a US commanded military machine, and every country in Europe is in it. Ukraine is one country that wasn't in it, made no difference. Ukrainian troops took part in the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They invited NATO in for weekly military maneuvers. They had tens of thousands of their own soldiers in training with NATO contractors. So you can be a non-member of NATO and still be totally in NATO. But the war is coming home. It really is. And I think it's going to become much harsher because winter is here now. And just the cost of everything is going up.
I want to ask, thanks.
But before, let's just see if there's anyone else with a question, because then you maybe handle that.
Yeah, my question is I know, for Cuban solidarity, sometimes you see the People's Forum organized or helped organize, I think, the drive to get donations to buy syringes for Cuba. I'm just wondering, I know each country is under different sanctions, and part of maybe the U.S. strategy is to make the laws so confusing and difficult that it's hard for activists to interpret, but has there been any work done to examine what are the legal ways that people in the U.S. can materially help countries that are under sanctions, we've seen successfully with Cuba, but kind of extending that to other countries, or sharing strategies between activists from different countries, and basically coming up with ways to legally provide support to countries under sanction. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Say? Oh, you want to say? Oh.
it's intentionally very difficult. It's very difficult, legally. And we know, for example, IFCO, Pastors for Peace, all their accounts were frozen for several years, simply because they were providing medical assistance to Cuba. But there are programs, I think NODUTDOL has participated in programs to the DPRK, and from here, at People's Forum and IFCO and at quite a number of groups, there were programs for Cuba, for Venezuela, seeds and all kinds of things for Nicaragua. But legally, it has been, again and again, the US government comes down, just like they do against countries trying to help. I think everyone knows about the Holy Land Five, and that this was Arab people who were donating for orphanages in Gaza. What could be simpler? They're doing 30 years in jail for it, even though it was a US registered foundation. So it's very difficult, and yet it continues. And even with risks, there are people who are determined to not let it happen.
Yes. When you talk about this, is also I always keep telling people that don't put U.S. sanctions in your mind, because it's another form of U.S. exceptionalism. Because around the world, there's a different way to deal with this or what you see. When your brother's comrade just said about this, in Chinese TV, we see every day news about European grassroots organization, labor union, and even activists, even celebrities against the NATO, EU, US sanctions against Russia. That's hardly reported. One of the things I was very amazed was this year's Nobel Prize of Literature from France, she openly against French government the sanction against Russia and participate in the protest. It was on the news in Europe, it was on news in Russia, it was the news in China, but I didn't see any news coverage in US. So that, I mean, if you Google, I probably can find that, I'm for sure. But to break the sanction, I know that's the reason many people fear that in China, that when I said help me, and that they don't want to mention a name because they don't want to get sanctioned in the US. But at the same time, there's an international different level of cooperation bypassing US and Western country, then break the sanction that's working every day. Like Sara just mentioned about the President Xi of China went to Saudi Arabia and then have all this meeting. That's another very important significance that Western media never talk about, is a de-dollarization. That means no longer use US dollar for transactions. Try to avoid to use the so-called SHIFT, not until the sanction this year. No one even know about SHIFT. Is how when you do the international financial transaction in the bank, you need to have a SHIFT code. So they try to do different type and then creating your Chinese transaction system, Russian transaction system, different way to avoid to use US dollars or US banking institutions. That have been happening. Even the last documentary, I went to the China International Import Fair, that's a large Afghanis business participated. That's right now, US and Europe and EU are still sanctioned, heavily sanctioned against Afghanistan. So whether they need to find a new trade partner, China and Russia, right now many Afghani products are selling to China for agricultural products, and China are doing business and trade business into Afghanistan. And not yet bypassing a US sanction and bypassing the dollar things. That's the reason why that's happening. Yesterday, there's a terrorist attack against in Kabul. That was actually run by Chinese companies, a hotel run by Chinese companies. So that's always, that also media didn't say, because in China it's a big news. It's not just only a terrorist attack against a hotel in Kabul, but that is specifically run by Chinese companies, and most of the customers are from China. So there's always going to be an attack, not just only talking about the legal way, not only talking about racism, but also could be a very dangerous against you. But that's the way we need to fight against. But also there's around the world, they will find a solution to work around and fight against back the U.S. imperialism and also the sanctions.
Any last comments or questions? Either one are fine. Yeah.
I think that if you're able to, kind of going back to what you were asking, if you're able to go and visit some of these sanctioned countries yourself, I think that really helps with really combating the narratives that the U.S. pushes here about these countries. So trying your best to make it out there and documenting what you're seeing, right? I think that one of the biggest things that happened to me to kind of put me into this anti-imperialist space was going to China and going to Russia and going to Palestine and seeing for myself that everything I learned about these places was a lie, just a straight up lie and propaganda. And it's really important for us to push back wherever possible, even if it's a social media post that people in your network are seeing. That goes a long way, right? Or if you hear somebody make a sly comment about, oh, but aren't people in the DPRK oppressed, or aren't people in Venezuela oppressed, or aren't people in Cuba oppressed? You say, actually, they have more freedom than we do here, and let me tell you why. I think doing that, those one-on-one conversations, really goes a long way, because maybe you're not going to change that person's mind in that moment, but you planted a seed in their minds that they're going to carry with them, especially if they're hearing this from somebody that they know and they trust. So I think that just having those conversations will go a long way.
So, and anyone who can do this, you want to shoot some little video comments, is that right?
Yes, we would like for the documentary, you see that the people have been carrying a sign that you can write a message, maybe end the sanction, or maybe no war with China, or maybe vaccine justice, some message like that, and then take a photo and then 5 seconds comment. We try to keep pushing and put into the documentary before Friday, and then so we're more. I don't want to keep using some kind of we keep talking, but we want to have more activist face into the documentary. If you want to do it, and then it would be great, and then just let me know. I'll be standing here waiting for you. Thank you. Anyone want to do it? Anyone want to do a message? Someone.